We're starting now. So some quick housekeeping things. The bathroom is through that door and to the left. You can take the bathroom. In the event of an emergency, you would be leaving through those front doors that you walked into. Other than that, I would like to introduce Chris Gitterman, who is our speaker today. Chris is a research scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder and a member of the paleoclimate team at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. His research interests include dendrochronology, fire ecology, and the drivers of historical fire activity. And today, Chris will be talking about historical wildland fire in the northeastern US as reconstructed from tree rings. So.
All right, thanks, Alex. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to those of you online. Hopefully you can hear me. If not, try to ping Alex and we'll get word across. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so that was a really nice introduction. I didn't know she was gonna do that. I'm not used to being introduced. So basically, this is my intro slide. So yes, I work for the University of Colorado in an organization called CERES. It's a cooperative institute with NOAA. So I'm embedded within the NOAA World Data Service for Paleoclimatology, which is a global repository for all kinds of different paleoclimate and paleoenvironmental archive data and proxy data. So, ice cores, ocean sediments, boreholes, and a whole lot of tree rings. And so I have the great honor and privilege to work with the team from kind of the user standpoint to help understand the tree ring data and other data sources that are coming in, and to help kind of lead the team through managing the data set that way. I also get the opportunity to do a lot of research, especially with tree rings, that helps promote or build our database. And so my focus is on tree ring fire history. And so I'll be showing you a lot of that. I'm really honored to be here at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve presenting on fire stuff, because this, to me, is like the heart of fire in the Northeast, really one of the places, if not the place, where we have an active fire regime and really building a massive amount of knowledge around the use of fire, the effects of fire, and the benefits of fire. So it's really cool to come here and kind of talk about it, because I feel like I have a little sliver of knowledge to add, but there's so much knowledge being built in this place that is really special. And it's fun to start with that previous slide, because it actually shows, what we would consider good fire, right? It's beneficial to the ecosystem. It's not particularly dangerous. Most of the time, what we end up hearing about and talking about are these sorts of really horrible incidences revolving around wildland fire and wildfire in particular. We all, just this past January kind of witnessed, maybe from afar, maybe from close, the effects of just raging wildfire on communities and cities. And typically giving a talk about fire in March or in the middle of winter, I have to kind of remind people what that is. But that's not, even in my short career, that's not the case anymore. This is in the news every month of the year. There's always something going on, really kind of indicating change. But this change, this new thing around fire has been going on for a while. There are a lot of examples of places being affected by fire, particularly in California, the Dixie fires, and other incidences, just one after another, just really not stopping and affecting our cities and our towns, and then affecting the forest ecosystem. So we see just all of these headlines about unprecedented fire, 1 million acres on fire. 2023, kind of burns bright, so to speak, in our memory of just the amount of fire that was happening across Canada. It was overwhelming. And for here in the Northeast, we got, all of that smoke, or a lot of that smoke. And so it wasn't really bright for us. It was pretty dim. It was very smoggy. And people, at least in my community, finally were seeing, hey, this is wildfire smoke. Whereas when we would get smoke from California, there was only like a few of us that seemed to really know what that was, that this was, oh, it's from this fire in California. We're getting the smoke now. Canada changed that. People are aware that this stuff can transfer very long distances, and really cloud, our skies, literally our skies, and hurt our air quality in a lot of places. We also are losing a lot of carbon emissions. So there's global impacts of these fires in terms of our climate, in terms of our public health. And so I think this idea that we need knowledge around fire is becoming much more obvious in the public mind, and hopefully in the minds of policymakers as well. For me, I've often kind of thought long and hard about ecosystems, and so seeing the effects of these kinds of fires in ecosystems to me is pretty devastating and shocking. I've done a lot of work on looking at the post-fire effects and how these forests develop and respond to wildland fires, especially high severity fires, and especially in the southwestern US, where conifer forests are typically converting to oak dominated shrub fields. And so it's a total change in the type of wild system you have. And so all of your ecosystem services, your habitat, water quality, carbon dynamics, everything changes because of these fires. So that's always been something on my mind. And the research is on this, right? There's a good history, a good amount of research going into looking at these changing fire regimes over time, and the aspects of them that are changing. So we see, longer fire seasons. So the probability of getting fire just goes up if you have more months of the year. Now we're saying it's pretty much all year in a lot of these places. It's also drier. Most of the largest fire years occurred in the last 20 years and ongoing. And then alarmingly, not only are we getting more acres burned, but we're getting more acres burning at high severity. So tree killing fire component of forest, that proportion is going up. And so we're expanding the amount of forest that we're killing with fires. But as a paleoecologist, I see these change, and whenever you see these headlines that are most extreme or whatever, we kind of put a question mark on it. Like, well, is that change normal or not? Is this new? Is this different from a longer term lens? Because that perspective is important, right? We need to know where we're at based on how do we get here and what's the past. And so most of the work that we've done as a science community around wildland fire kind of starts in 1984. That's the time period when we can start looking at fires across the globe and really mapping them. And so other ways to understand fire before 1984 are difficult because we have to use other sources of information. And so even Gary Larson recognized this, right, and said, look, these trees hold information about the past. And, he makes a joke out of it about a father and a son cutting down a tree and said, look, that's where this tree survived a big old wildfire. But, couldn't survive his saw. So, we take this perspective and bring it to the forefront to try to understand current conditions. But it's important to understand even within that, like, where are we even starting? And so we know very well that, especially for the Western United States, Western North America, but in Eastern North America to a large degree too, we have a huge change in culture and in how we interact with and manage landscapes. And we've lost that historical culture. It's been taken away through colonization and appropriation. And then we have public policies, federal policies like Smokey Bear that then reduce the amount of fire on the landscape dramatically. And so we're working in that context. So all of the information we know about fire from 1984 is imprinted upon what's 100 years of inertia in changing forest dynamics because of the lack of fire, general lack of fire in most places. So that's important to recognize. But that doesn't mean that what we're able to pull from the past is irrelevant. And so how do we get there? What's the information that we're drawing upon? And so like I've been passing around these tree ring samples. This is how they form. So I'll kind of give a little introduction on dendrochronology, how it works, how do we get tree ring data to look at fire, and then kind of what are some of the insights that we've gleaned from that. So the process is we have these fires that burn through landscapes along the surface. They don't kill that many large trees. They can scar them, but not kill them. So these trees survive fire after fire. And the scars are preserved on the rings or within the rings. And as dendrochronologists, we can take those tree rings and look at the pattern of wide and narrow and other characteristics with the ring, like the lightness or darkness of the late wood. And there's certain characteristics that get passed from tree to tree to tree and kind of lock them in time. So we have these trees that are growing distinct annual rings every year, growing outwards. It's a very convenient proxy data set for us to look at annual change in tree growth. And trees are really remarkable at capturing their environments, and they capture climate signals really well, whatever their limiting factor is, typically moisture in temperate environments. So, these 3 oak trees from over 100 miles apart all capture the same, wet years and dry years. And you can literally, this is kind of rare to be able to do this, but it illustrates the practice of what we do in cross state really well, is that you can lock them together like a puzzle. So you take that pattern of wide, narrow, wide, narrow, wide, narrow, whatever it is, you see it on one tree, you see it in the next tree, and you can put them together. So it's just like doing a puzzle. And once you do that, you have 100% confidence that you've locked that in, that ring grew in 1580, this tree's ring grew in 1580, and I know with 100% certainty that is the same year. Because you know that these rings are annual, they only grow during the summer season. You just have to figure out what summer season they grew in. The tree's not lying, you just have to figure it out. It's a puzzle. And so we can take that process, build a chronology from live trees back in time by taking other resources of wood. So in this illustration, we have live trees, we have a pattern of wide and narrow rings, and then we take an old dead tree, in this case, it looks like a bristlecone pine up at high elevation, and we see the same pattern of wide and narrow rings, we can lock it in. So now we take something that died on the landscape, we don't know when it grew, and we can figure out each one of those rings when it grew by matching it up with the live tree chronologies. And now we have a calendar date associated with it. Because the live tree, if we go core a tree outside right now, we know that the last ring is going to be from 2024. And there probably won't be anything from 2025 because it's March and the trees haven't started growing yet. So that last ring will be 2024. We have a calendar date, and then we just figure it out going back. And in this case, we go to Pueblo and structure to look at the roof timbers and stuff. There's actually one of these on the table over there. That's from a roof timber of a Pueblo structure in New Mexico that was cut over 1,000 years ago, or about 1,000 years ago. And so we know that because we can date the rings. And so in fire history, we're going around the landscape and we're looking for evidence of fire preserved in these trees. So here's this stump that we were able to find. It has kind of this characteristic shape at the bottom, this open wound. It has some char on the inside, and it has all of these sort of serrated edges. You can kind of see these faint lines in the slide. These kind of serrated edges of the wound ribs, healing over each of the scars. So we generate an eye, we kind of learn how to find these in the woods and where they are, and we go and find them. And we can sample them with a chainsaw and date them. And, you can count the fire scars on the end. Sometimes we get lucky. This one that my dog didn't find, but my field crew found, had 38 fire scars. So that's the second most in the state of Arizona, a Douglas fir. So that was really cool. Kind of these little treasure troves in the woods, this long history of fire in a certain place. So that stump never moves, right? And so it's picking up all these fire events that are coming through and scarring that tree. So we can build then a fire history by taking these live trees, same process that I showed in that diagram, dating the fire scars, dating the tree rings, finding dead trees on the ground, dating the tree rings, dating the fire scars. And then we build this fire history. And I'm sorry, it's actually cut off on the bottom there, apologies. But you can see the horizontal lines here is the life history of a given tree. The vertical tick marks are the fire scars. So you can see how they line up in time. So you get a sense for the scale of burning. So like every tree in that last fire recorded it. They all scarred in that fire. And then it becomes a little more noisy back in time. The difference between the dotted lines and the solid lines going horizontally, the solid line is when the tree is called recording. So basically what happens is you have this period of time when the tree is young, it's growing, and the bark is protecting it from fire, and it's not scarring, it's resisting it. So most trees in the forest look like this. They never scar, but that doesn't mean they don't experience fire. And then something happens, a hot fire, a branch, build up a duff on the uphill side of a tree, something to get that fire to linger a little longer, penetrate the bark with its heat and kill the cambium. The cambium is the living material between the wood and the bark, like it's, the outside of the tree. It's the only living material on the trunk or the bole of a tree. And so if you kill that cambium in just a spot, it creates a wound. You back into a tree with your car in it, and you break the bark, you've now created a scar. You've killed the cambium underneath that bark. And so it will try to heal over that. When it tries to heal over that, it adds a lot of resin to protect the wood from rotting. And so you can see like this dark kind of red ribbon. It's just extra resin that the tree has intentionally put in that wound to protect itself from fungal infections and rot. But resin's very flammable. It's like fat wood. If you've ever bought that from LL Bean or something, you can match like this. And so the next fire comes along and it's like a wick. It just picks it right up and it records the next fire and then the next one, next one. So this set of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on fire scars, it's newly recorded on the tree, but that same process you can imagine going back further in time. In fact, I have trees from this site that go hundreds of years further back, and the fire regime doesn't change. It's that frequent. It's just that this tree didn't record one until the first scar at 1700. And then they record on out, and then things change, which we'll get into. But this is what fire histories look like. And, they're really simple, but as I hope to show you, we can learn a lot from them. And one thing we've been able to do, this is kind of a really fun project I've been involved with for a number of years now, is compile all of the tree ring fire history sites we can get across North America. So we have this treasure trove, this rich data set of tree ring fire histories all over forested ecosystems, all over North America. More dense in some places than in others, but still it's a massive amount of data. It's the largest compilation of tree ring fire scar histories of anywhere in the world. And, we're hoping to expand, but we got North America now. So there's about 3,000 sites in here. About 2,500 of them, we have the fire scar data that we're using. And, this is one of the powers of tree rings, is that because of that precise date with, 100% accuracy, we don't have a plus or minus around any date. That 1851 scar is 1851. It's the same year in New York as it is in California. And so we can say, if these two places record fire in 1851, then that gives us a sense for where fire is in the same year. And we can compare that to other precisely dated proxies. Like we have really good drought reconstructions for North America. And so we can say, oh, that was a dry year there, and we got fire. So those sorts of things. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the sort of North America level projects that we've been working on to give you a sense for what we can do as we build a network of tree rings, and then show you where we're at in the Northeast, because I put Northeast in the title. And so I want to give it some time, but I'll tell you that it's not nearly as well developed as the Western US. And it's, being represented in this larger North America aspect, but not as strongly as we're trying to get to. So it's kind of a frontier area to work here. So as I mentioned, we can combine historical climate data with these fire scar data. And so we have a gridded soil moisture reconstruction for all of North America, and we can look at that with fire and try to learn, firstly, where are the regions? So we put this through some clustering, and we looked at independently the fire. So fire scar sites are within these hexels in the background color of the climate. We said, okay, where is climate synchronous? Like, where do droughts tend to occur in space and time together? And where do fires tend to occur in space and time together? And we threw those independently through computer algorithms, and it came out with this, a very well kind of synchronized, if you will, consistent set of 3 regions that are synchronous. So the question being, when we get fires in California and Colorado in the same year, like we did in 2020, is that odd? Is that rare? And what these data sets will tell us is, well, not necessarily, but on some years, yeah, it's not average, because California tends to burn with the Pacific Northwest, Colorado tends to burn with the Southwest. And then you can see the East is a really large region, but again, there's a lot more error, a lot less confidence in that region. There's more buttons to click than I remembered. So the statistics are really good, and we kind of see the regionality of fire. So then what's interesting about that is that these regions tend to be pretty stable over time. There's not a lot of change, although in the Southeast, there seems to be some sort of climate signal switch that kind of changes how these places are interacting with each other climatologically. Fire-wise, that tends not to do that. The fire scar sites tend to be consistent through time. So we have really a level of fire synchrony in subregions of North America that is very consistent historically. And so when we start seeing those same regions pop out in the modern era, we shouldn't be surprised. That's the system working. That's how it works. That's the synchronicity between climate and fire. When and if fire starts expanding across much larger regions, like we're seeing, fires in all these different places the same year, then we know that the system is changing, and the synchrony of fire is going up in terms of spatially. And that could be a very clear signal of increased drought. I would expect that to happen as the climate warms and as we get more widespread and deep droughts. So our recent fire years unprecedented. We have all of these, record fire years. 2020, I bring up 2 million hectares burned in the Western US in 2020. It overwhelmed our capacity to handle those fires. And so we have, all of these news articles saying these are unprecedented. Wildfires are unprecedented. Fire managers are like, we have not seen anything like this. So what we're able to do is take this fire history network and overlap these fire polygons because we have really good satellite data. We know where the fires in the modern era are, and we can see if they're burning in our fire history sites out west, and see what the area burn looks like in terms of what we would expect and in the frequency of those fires. So we generate expectations for the frequency of fires in the modern era based on the frequency of historical fires, and then we can generate expectations for how large, like how many acres would we expect to be burning at any one time. So we can ask, is it unprecedented or not? And what we found is that it's decisively not. That the amount of acres burned, just acres burning in especially Western North America, but this graph shows all North America, is way below what we would expect. So years like 2020 that were historic fire years burned about 6% of the fire history network. But we have many years beyond that. That was kind of an average year. It's sort of a 1 in 3 year event. Years like 1748, we see fire all over the Western US. And so 29% of sites burned then, which represents a massive amount of area versus what we saw in 2020. So what the fire history network is telling us is that there was a lot more fire historically, much more widespread, especially out west, but probably in the east as well, than we get now. The caveat is like I said, that well, I'll get to this, but the caveat here is about severity. So if we're thinking just extent, we're not there. So what we're showing is this fire deficit. We're showing frequent fire historically leading up to about the turn of the century. And then no more fires, that curl. I mentioned we record fires really well until we don't. And then you get this curl. You get this period of time in the 20th century where there's no fire. The trees would have recorded it if it happened. It didn't happen until recently. So that's the fire deficit. And so this is, goes back much further than the treeing record can demonstrate. Paleo record of charcoal shows the same thing. This is another way to quantify that with the tree rings. So what this means is that kind of what I opened with a little bit, this change in ecosystem. So when we have frequent fire, we have these really open forests. We can look back to historical photos, historical data, General Land Office surveys, and we see these open forests historically that experienced a frequent fire regime. And then without fire, we have a densification of the forest. We have 100 times too many trees coming into a lot of these stands, really filling them in, no fire to keep it thin and open. This stand was never logged. So logging plays into this across a lot of land area, but in this picture, no logging at all. This is a forest preserve, but it still came in like gangbusters, just trees everywhere. And you're trying to wade yourself through it. And so you can only imagine what happens when that burns is it goes up in high severity because now you have a ton of fuel in the ground. And like I said, the last 20 years have included some of the driest years in the last 100 years or even longer. So when you have all of that fuel and you dry it out a whole lot, it burns really hot and really fast. And so that's our fire crisis. That's what we're dealing with now. And, we've gotten pushback in the scientific community, the treeing community that, well, that's just, your perspective is just based on the fire history sites. So we went just to fire history sites and said, okay, is the same thing happening? Are the fires more severe now than they were historically? And yes, absolutely. These sites that burned, this tree has what, a dozen fire scars on it. And sites that are just like this, if it burned now, this tree would be dead. And, like all of these trees that recorded 6, 7, 8 fires up until 1900, then die in 2002 in a fire. So they had resisted this kind of disturbance before, but the disturbance changed. Our fire regimes have changed. Another thing we can do, again, looking at area, is ask whether today's megafires or the gigafires, as they're being called too, these huge fires. So we know that fire deficit shows that we don't have as much fire across North America as we did historically. But are the individual fires, the ones that are burning 1 million acres, 2 million acres, are those different than what burned historically? And so we can actually put in fire history networks in such a way that we can reconstruct area of fire by kind of filling in the gaps, saying if this site and this site and this site burn together, then that equates to this amount of area. So again, I have like 2 slides on this, so I can't go into all the details, but basically we went into the wildfire in Arizona, which burned in 2011. It's the largest fire in Arizona's history. It's the 4th largest wildfire in the Western US history, which goes back to about 1984. So we asked the question, we put in a grid of sites around and we asked the question, is that anomalous? Is it large? And there's some statistics to this, but basically in the last 300 years, there are 4 fires that either equate to or exceed the wildfire area. They're within the margin of error that we can say the wildfire would look like from just tree rings. We know exactly how much area the wildfire burned, but the tree ring perspective gives us that kind of pink band. It's in this range. So all of those bars have a similar amount of error around them. They're just not showing it for clarity. But these 4 different years show the same amount of area. So no, the wildfire was not that big if you put it on a historical perspective. So these big fires we're getting, again, in area are not that large. And all of these fires burned right to the edge of our study area, so they probably kept going. We actually don't have sites in such a way to say, okay, well, in 1847 and 1851, this site did not burn. So we know that that was the edge of the fire. We don't have those sites. So we need more data to keep, like, how big were those fires? And to have, you know, almost back to back 2 fires in 4 years that burn the amount of area the wildfire burned is incredible to me. And it shows the openness and the grassiness of this ecosystem compared to now when the wildfire blew out, sort of a wet mix conifer kind of system, Douglas fir, Grand fir, Hunter's pine, you know, and put in some big holes of high severity fire that those forest types just simply weren't there. Historically, it was grass. These fires would sweep across the landscape for weeks or months and do very little damage and a lot of benefit to the ecosystem. So then the question is, are these big fires we're getting now helping to pay off the fire deficit? Is there a benefit to how big they are? If we're not getting a lot of small fires like we did historically, are the big fires paying it off? So basically we looked at the difference between area burn in 20-year increments historically versus now, and showing that no, the wildfire did absolutely nothing to help us pay off the amount of area that we owe this landscape in burning. So we owe this landscape about 2.5 million acres of fire over a 100-year period. And then we burned it at 500,000 acres, and that just didn't do it. It didn't pay it off. It didn't make a dent. Really trying to figure out, you know, what's this fire deficit look like and how do we resolve it? So that brings us to the east. So now we have a growing network of fire history sites. And this is, I show this stuff out west because I'm like, this is the hope, right? This is where we're trying to get to and trying to understand fire in the East Coast. But the East Coast is its own beast, right? We have long debates and like decades of debate about the role and the function of fire in the Northeast and how that played out in terms of climate, in terms of people, in terms of landscapes. And, you know, if you push all of the ideas to 2 end members, it's sort of like the idea that the New England was burning all the time and was open and looked like a park-like area, you know, with big open oak and pine and whatever, burning all the time, basically under indigenous management, versus never burned ever. You know, just asbestos forest cannot burn. So those are like the 2 end camps. And there's very few people that are fully in one or the other. There's a lot of middle ground. And so that's what we're trying to kind of learn, like, how do we navigate that space? So this widespread indigenous fire management idea comes out of a lot of documentation of indigenous land use, indigenous burning, and as much traditional ecological knowledge as we can glean by working with tribes, and myself and others are doing that work, trying to understand what knowledge is left. Basically, so much of it has been taken away. And it's a really tragic story of you know, this area and our people. But there's a lot of documentation of native burning. There's old maps, so a lot of firsthand accounts, like this map from the New Hampshire-Maine border. On the right side, it's hard to read, but the Piscataqua area, it says, a large swamp of white pine burned by the Indians. So, you know, there's accounts of Native American burning. And then kind of on the other side is this sort of climatological and observational data set that basically the forest is asbestos. It does not burn. It's too wet. And you can't burn it other than, maybe along the coasts in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Southern Massachusetts, on down, New York, down into Pennsylvania. It's kind of a different system. There's sort of this pyro line that you go north of that in New England, and it just becomes asbestos. You just can't burn it. Craig Lorimer, in the 70s did work to show that northern Maine has an 800-year fire return interval, which is basically, it doesn't burn. And then we have kind of evidence of that in terms of the paleoecology, even for the southern New England area where we do have more, probability of burning, drier forests, drier area, saying there's, really no fire that this is, there was fire long ago, but then the forests were shaped by climate, not by people. And then that kind of leads to this interpretation, sort of spoken quite well here by David Foster, that in New England, where woodlands are often referred to as the asbestos forests, there are no fire-dependent species. There are some species that will survive better than others. So there's there's fire-tolerant trees, but there's no fire-dependent trees. So there are none that require fire in order to be maintained in those parts of the country. So that's, an expansive perspective to say there's really nothing in New England that requires fire for its, prolonging life. So like what we're doing here in the pine bush would probably be a really rare exception, right? Than anywhere else in New England. But, it still burns, right? We still have a lot of evidence of fire now. We have big fires now that are very problematic in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and Louisiana, Nova Scotia in the 2023 fire years. Nova Scotia looks like coastal Maine. And, houses were burned, the town was affected. This was a big deal. And then we have Vermont just last fall, right? In New York, Brooklyn, there's fires. So there was a lot of wildfire in New Jersey, Connecticut. And I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, so kind of right across the border from Vermont. So these fires were sending smoke over to us and we were watching them. It was a really interesting case because it was kind of alarmist about how much fire there was. And I know Neil looks at this picture. I certainly look at this picture and say, wow, that white smoke looks great, because, the white smoke shows us that fine fuels are burning and it's not that hot of a fire. When it's black smoke, then trees are dying and you're getting much more combustion. So they reported here 82 wildfires, all human caused, burned 159 acres. So, that's like 10,000 maple taps. And, that's a lot. That's sad. There were definitely structures burned, people lost property. There were some problems with this, but in terms of the scale of problem versus out west, we're not there yet, right? And if you know what you're looking for and you look hard enough, you can find the evidence of historical fires in New England. So these are areas up by Mount Washington, Conway. The one in the middle is from Lyme, New Hampshire, just up the road. It's about 4 miles from Dartmouth College campus, about 4 miles from my house. And, I was walking with my kids and they needed a snack. We were like, half mile into the trail. And so we sat down, I looked over and I was like, I'll be damned. I did not know that I was going to find fire scars here. And I was almost kind of ducking, like somebody's going to call me out on this, but I know what I'm looking at. There's char on that piece of wood that had 8 fire scars on an eastern white pine piece about the size of my hand up on a ridge in Lyme, New Hampshire. So there are evidence of frequent fire if you know where to look. And, we have really good model. This is Rich Guyette, others work to use chemistry and physics and precipitation and temperature to model how much fire you would expect on the landscape in northern New England. And throughout, they did this for all of North America. I'm just zooming in on New England. And so you can see that kind of asbestos, those purple colors, long fire return intervals would be predicted for this landscape. And yet all the red triangles sort of, belie that, say, no, actually there's evidence of frequent fire in these places that you would predict to not have them. And so that kind of goes back to the human part of that too. Certainly as we go south, that network coming up the Appalachians into Pennsylvania is very extensive and really solid, really good data. And here's just one example of, finding fire histories that go pre-Columbian, right? So there's no colonial influence on the scars that are embedded in these trees that they discovered. And they say fire scars provide physical evidence that fire was an important ecological component of this landscape before and after 1492, and that the current period of reduced fire, so now, is unprecedented in the last 500 years. So, these red pine forests that they found and sampled in Pennsylvania are really showing this long history of burning. And what's unprecedented is the lack of fire now. And that's the same thing we found out west when we were looking at the fire deficit. The unprecedented part is not the size of the fires today, it's the lack of fire today. So we're trying to do this a little bit here in the Albany Pine Bush. What can we learn about, fire history from tree rings? So Neil and Tyler provided a really great source of stumps from one of these thinning operations that happened, and we found fire scars on them. Here's one of them. It looks like anything you might find out west. It's just not very old. But we did have fire scars going back into the 50s. And actually Neil's son, Aiden, worked this stuff up as an internship, part of his college program. And, kind of produce the triangles there are fire scars from these trees that they gave us just from one stand. And then the bars come from observed fires, this kind of fire atlas that they pulled together for the Albany Pine Bush. And so we see, some of these were observed, some of them weren't. The number of triangles refers to the number of trees. So we're kind of trying to understand the tree ring perspective of fire in the pine bush and whether or not we can push that back in time. The squiggly line is tree growth. And so you can see the effect of fires, it reduces growth. And so it became very clear that you have these narrow rings in the years of fire in these stands. These were not thin, they were not being managed. These were sort of wildfires in the 50s and 60s. So we're also working with a group led by Kitty Glover, who's out in California, looking at evidence of fire throughout the northern New England region. This is kind of focused in on the Gulf of Maine. And, there's a lot of paleoecology evidence, and I kind of showed some of the indigenous knowledge evidence, or at least observations. And so, kind of showing this perspective that, fire isn't everywhere, but it is pretty common in different places. And it may or may not direct the vegetation type, but it was part of the ecosystem. And it might have maintained a vegetation type for a long period of time, particularly when it's low severity, recurrent fire. You can really maintain a vegetation type like red pine. So I'll zoom in real quick. I know I'm kind of getting down to the wire on time. Actually, no, I'm doing okay. So this is a project I have going with myself and colleagues at Plymouth State University, looking at the history of fire in the kind of Mount Washington Valley area. This is a confluence of two major rivers that were very commonly used by Abenaki peoples, since time immemorial to access kind of the northern forest areas around the presidential range and get up into Canada and everything. So there's these pretty small red pine stands up high on the ridges, most of which have never been logged. So they're a really rare unlogged piece of forest in northern New England, whereas a lot of the valley bottoms have been cleared probably more than once in the last few hundred years. These areas were spared that for different reasons, but they represent this kind of like possibly pre-colonial example of forests in the Northeast, which we don't really have very much of. They're not particularly old growth forests, but they've been there for a really long time. And so we want to study their history of fire and kind of see what we can learn about them. So focusing in on just this area here in the Green Hills Preserve, this is a Nature Conservancy landscape. So looking across, we have these 4 sites on this mountain range. They encompass about 100 hectares, so like 250 acres of land. We have 4 sites scattered on 4 different mountains. And we expected, we knew there were fire scars because we scouted the whole mountain range and we kind of knew where we were going, but we expected just sort of kind of random fires distributed around the range. But we were really surprised to find that actually, when we have a fire at one site, so these different tiles like this and this, those are a single site. So these are individual trees at individual sites labeled, and then at the bottom is a composite of all of them by site. So you're seeing 4 different sites. What we're seeing is the fires burn the entire tree ring site almost always. We get the whole thing, every tree will scar. But what's incredible is if you look at kind of how those lines line up, all 4 sites would burn at the same time. And so not only were we getting frequent fire, but we were getting pretty extensive fire. Remember, this record year in Vermont was 159 acres. This is multiple 250 plus acre fires, individual fires, not just 82 fires. So this is, spreading landscape fire, which I was not expecting to find in New England. I thought it would be really patchy. You might get a patch of blueberries that, got burned one spring for, maintenance of the blueberry stands underneath these red pine stands, or maybe a lightning strike or something like that. But this is like fire sweeping across the whole mountain. And so we started sharing this with people and wondering, what's going on? We have this long history. Well, they said, well, it's the railroads. Oh, okay, yeah, railroads. There's, this is right on the side of a valley. Railroad goes right up the valley. Railroad spark fires. So we found out that was built in 1876. So there's all this fire that predates that for hundreds of years. So we don't have pre-Columbian here. So this is sort of this transitional indigenous colonial period in that area. But, whether colonists were copying what the indigenous peoples were doing or not, there was fire going for a long time, hundreds of years before that. There's also this evidence. I'll use my mouse so then maybe, can you see my mouse? You cannot see my mouse. Yeah, there we go. So these are the inner ring dates of trees, and we sample pretty close to the ground. And so when you see kind of a vertical line like this, that indicates, a set of trees coming in roughly at the same time. We call that a cohort, right? It's an age cohort in this stand. These are pretty small plots, so these age cohorts are fairly tight, but they're not really synchronous, and they don't line up with fire scars too well. They do okay. But that gives us some indication that not only are these fires spreading, but they're kind of popping little patches of high severity, because to get a whole cohort to come in, you need growing space. These trees are fairly intolerant to shade. And so this is evidence that these stands will burn at high severity, but not across a big area, right? Those are asynchronous across the whole mountain. So it's not like 100 acres goes in one shot. It might be 5, small patches. These trees come in, and while that process is happening, you're getting ground fires through here as well, burning that whole mountain range at times. The railroads represent a new ignition source. So we don't have indigenous people managing blueberry stands or burning for hunting or any of the myriad reasons why somebody might want to burn, and particularly indigenous peoples managing those landscapes with burn, or colonists either copying that or trying to get rid of the rattlesnakes or chasing deer out or whatever the case might be. The ignition source now changed to railroads. So we get all of these fires that are pretty extensive now being sparked by the train going by. To me, I'm okay with that. I'm more interested in the ecology. I'm more interested in the effect of those fires and the benefit of those fires for the forest. How they get started is less important. And that's like one thing I'd like to diminish is like, oh, it's a lightning fire, we should keep that, versus it's a human start, we should put that out. Because to me, it's the vegetation and the setting and the place that's important, and the effects of that fire, not how the fire got started. Okay, so we have the railroads then generating fires. And then the most profound change here is 1909 is the last fire year. Burn the whole mountain range again, and then done. Like there's 1 or 2 scars after that, but nothing really at all after 1909. And that happens to be the first year that New Hampshire passed a fire prevention law and hired a state forester. So now we have fire suppression. So the 1910 rule out west was the 1909 rule in New Hampshire. We stopped burning. So that's really the human signal here, is that we've ended the fire regime and we've created a fire deficit. If we look back at that prediction of how frequent fires should be, in all of these sites we have, some of these are more preliminary than others, we're ahead of it. That the model would predict, at the shortest interval, 20 years, up to close to 100 years, and we're in that 8 to 15 year period. So frequent fire, by definition, frequent fire at these sites, in potentially representing a much larger area than we have, but we've again reduced the amount of these forests, mostly by logging, but also by other changes, like the conversion of these forests from red pine dominance to red spruce, hemlock, red maple, other tree species that come into these stands without fire. So this is work by Adele Fenwick in her dissertation on the other side of the valley from where I just showed you the Green Hills. This is South Moat. And she has other sites that show the same thing. So the structure of these stands right now is a lot of small trees that are fire intolerant and a few red pine. And if you look at when the red pine were recruiting, they were coming in very consistently and dominating the stand until 1909. And then the fire stopped. I think the last fire here is 1903. Fire stopped, and then you get these other species coming in. It's the same story back in Pennsylvania. So again, I just pulled one quote out of this one paper, but there's a lot of papers that this group has put together that show the same thing. So they said, we observed no evidence of any red pine trees regenerating since the beginning of fire exclusion practices circa 1915 in Pennsylvania. So the lack of fire is changing these forests way more than fires ever did. And so the story here is not that without fire, we get these choke stands and we get high severity fire. That's kind of the Western story, although it could happen, right? We have a lot of fuel in the ground, so we could see. But the story really in New England is without fire, we have that same curl. We have the same period with no fire, but we go through this process that is termed musification. And there's debate around this, but it's a pretty compelling argument that you get this sort of invasion of fire intolerant tree species into these stands, choking them off. And the more you do that, the more time you let go by, the harder it is to then burn it, because now you have a lot of fuels that aren't really ready to burn very easily, like red maple leaves and hemlocks and things like that. So you can preserve these stands by letting them burn, by burning them intentionally, in particular, because some of them just need that extra, help, because our lightning doesn't come in when it's really dry like it does in some places of the West. So we need to help these stands if we want to preserve them. And like I said, these red pine stands, to me, are these, ancient relics of, prehistory, of pre-settlement, and I think deserve our attention and deserve our preservation, same way that the pine barrens here are getting that kind of attention through fire. And so when I look back at this, what do we learn from this record fire year in Vermont? Well, the article closes by quoting somebody there on the fire station that says, I think this has really opened people's eyes to where the funding might need to go. So they're going to buy a new wildland fire engine, and they hope it boosts the fire response and limits the reliance on fire departments. So they want to put out fire. They want more money to put out fire. And so, one could argue, and I would support the idea, that maybe that shouldn't be a blanket rule, that maybe fire has a place in these forests of the Northeast that, sorry, that was supposed to, anyway, that putting fire on this landscape actually could be very useful and very beneficial in certain places. I'm not going to say that everything should burn, but I'm also not going to say that nothing should burn. So just finding that middle ground, understanding the ecology of the system, and using fire in a smart way, like we see here at the pine bush, which this background picture was supposed to show. But anyway, that's what I got. So I want to thank the Pine Bush Reserve. I want to thank Neil in particular for inviting me to give this talk. My collaborators here in the North American Fire Scar Working Group, and with me in New England, Aidan Gifford, John Neely in particular, really helpful in building that Green Hills fire history. And some funding certainly deserves acknowledgement, all federal funding for research, for fire, for understanding what's going on in our ecosystem. So USGS Pal Center, the Northeast States Research Cooperative, which comes out of the Forest Service, and my base salary is paid for by NOAA's Climate Program Office and the National Centers for Environmental Information. So that's where this research has come out of. Let him get a picture. Anyway, thank you all for your attention. Thank you online for listening to me. And there's my email address. If anybody has questions later on, please email me. Otherwise, I'd love to take some questions now.
One question online, and then as they come in, I can take them, but anyone has a question?
Anybody in the room want to start out, or? Yeah, over here.
I'm still not very clear. I don't have background in this area. I'm still not real clear about what it is about frequent fires that makes a tree safer, less susceptible to damage in the fire. Is it when there's a fire and there's a scar and the fire gets in, and then later on the tree tries to heal it by spreading the resin? Does the resin help protect it in the future fire? Is that the mechanism?
Okay, so I'm just going to try to paraphrase for the folks online, because they wouldn't have been able to hear you. So basically the question is, what about frequent fire protects a tree from then being killed by a future fire? So when we have these recurrent fires over and over and over affecting the tree, how does it help? So from seeing the forest through the trees, frequent fire really helps to protect the forest from burning down by reducing fuels and maintaining kind of a sort of healthy, safe fuel load, so the fires never get going, because the wood stove doesn't get stuffed with wood, right? It keeps, like, you're just throwing a couple logs in, so it really can't burn that hot. For the tree in particular, it does not want to be scarred by fire. It has evolved with frequent fire. So, yellow pine trees like ponderosa pine, longleaf pine is a great example. You know, a lot of these kind of long-needled pine trees evolved with fire in their ecosystems and rely on it for regeneration, for clearing out the understory, getting rid of the grass, getting mineral soil exposed so the seeds can fall down. There's other mechanisms, but for these trees that scar, they have really thick bark and often flaky bark that this is a pitch pine from the pine bush, doesn't really have it, but the bark will flake off and that kind of pushes the heat away. And so they can resist a lot of burning, and that's their goal. They don't want to be scarred. But once they do get scarred, because it happens, you know, maybe a branch fell, maybe they got hit or something like that, that resin that they put in, so you can see all that dark resin, that's there mostly to protect it from fungal infection, or, you know, beetles that might bore into it. The heartwood here with the resin preserves the wood from rotting really, really well. And then it's not really intentional. It's kind of unlucky for the tree that it's one mechanism to protect itself from rotting, makes it really susceptible to then scarring again. But again, if these systems are burning recurrently, they don't tend to burn very hot. And so it can keep resisting those subsequent fires because the fire kind of moves quickly. These are fires that, you know, 1748 burns a whole mountain range. You could step over that fire. It's like wispy white smoke, kind of almost goes out at night, picks up the next day. Like my imagination of what these fires might look like, I don't have a time machine, wish I did, is that they're really not a big deal. We just kind of watch them and they'd go, right? And they're just doing their own thing. It's fire moving across the landscape like any creature might. The difference now is that you go 100 years without burning, you have this massive, you know, curl, you have this buildup of fuel, this thing dries out, and now when it burns, that fire gets into the tree, it roasts this. You know, you got duff layers that are this thick in some of these forests that used to have no duff at all, because they've burned so fast or burned so frequently. These trees are the first ones to go. And so whenever I'm working in a system and they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna do a prescribed burn next year, I'm like, really? I got to get in there because once they do a prescribed burn, all the fire scars are gone. It just, there's too much duff, there's too much fuel buildup. It burns up that evidence of frequent fire. So we try to get in before the first fire, the first entry fire. Did that answer your question?
I guess it's mostly the reduction of fuel that does.
Yeah.
That protects the tree.
Yeah, it's the bark thickness protects the individual tree. The reduction of fuel protects the whole ecosystem. Yeah, it's a really, I mean, you can imagine like you're burning every 4 years, your duff layer is only like, you could see through it. In fact, I went from working in stands that looked like this to longleaf stands managed for forest health and game management that are burning every year. And it's wild, the difference. I mean, like the grass is different. I mean, obviously they're different species, but just that the dynamic of not having 100 years of fuel buildup under my feet, the forest feels totally different. And take one from online. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you next.
This question is, it looks like on the North American tree ring fire scar slide that the US, including Alaska, seems to have a higher concentration of fires in comparison to Canada. And ask, what do you attribute that to?
Yes, that is true. I would attribute it to funding, to just, you know, there's a lot of researcher bias. If you look at any kind of large scale network, you're going to get biases in geographic distribution of who's doing the work, who has the money. It's a very underrepresented kind of science. We need more people doing this stuff, not fewer, to expand the number of sites in the representation of, you know, tree rings, fire history, science globally, right? I mean, there are places where we can do a lot more fire history that don't have any because of funding and limitations in infrastructure. I don't know. I can't say that Canada's in that boat, but it's harder to do it in northern forests. It's being done now. It's another frontier area. People are pushing pretty far north into Canada and finding fire scars. And, you know, there's kind of little dots of places that have been pretty well sampled, like north of the Great Lakes and up by Hudson Bay. But it's just kind of a frontier of we need more people on the ground hunting down these fire scars and sampling them. Alaska, I think, had a major campaign funded by the BLM or the USGS that produced a wide network of fire scar chronologies. And so that's a great benefit that we have those. Like I said, once these places burn, we lose it. And so we need those fire scars collected now. There's a lot of urgency in getting more of them because we want to understand what's going on in our ecosystems from all of those perspectives that I mentioned, fire, climate, carbon, people. Your question.
My question was very similar, but it was in regards to New York. Is there a particular reason that there's a lot less records here?
So it's really hard in New England to do this work in the Northeast. So in New York too, there are 2 fire history sites in the Adirondacks in red pine stands, just like the ones I showed. The Northeast is tricky from a climatological perspective. Wood on the ground rots really fast. And out west, in a lot of places, it won't rot, it will burn. And so if it hasn't burned, we can still find it. But here it's, 20, 30 years on the ground and it's dirt and it's really hard to pick it up. It's been really frustrating in my life to try to push in and find it, but that we're finding anything is really remarkable. A lot of places were logged, cleared, burned. The extent of agriculture in the Northeast wiped out probably a lot of evidence of historical fire. I think these red pine stands that we're seeing, like these little postage stamps on the ridges, probably went down across the valleys and up the other side. But we don't have that anymore. That mesification process is happening. So we're finding areas that are all hemlock and red maple. And if you kick around, there's 6 fire scars on that stump. It's like, it might just be this little thing that's like this big. You got to really dig around to find it. So yeah, it just kind of disappears from the landscape over time. We get to a lot of sites and we say, oh, we're 50 years too late. We needed to be here before. So it's the best we can do. Those sites are out there. If you're out hiking, send me a picture, find these fire scars. They're out there. You have a question? That's a really good question. If the wood falls, I love that you asked. You're probably my youngest audience member to ever ask a question. And I think that's super cool. No, once the wood falls, it stays on the ground and the tree can't take it back in, but it can decompose and all the nutrients and the goodies and stuff that are in that wood go back into the soil and then go back into the trees. And so that cycle of life can keep going. And so you get all the benefit of that wood back into the next plants. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, there's a couple more questions online. This person asks, is your dendrochronology data matched in any way with paleontology or ice core data?
Yeah, we're working on that to see correspondence between tree ring, fire scar, fire history data, and ice cores. Tree ring fire scars have this amazing feature that they record fire that touches the tree. Ice cores record fires that put smoke in the air, that wafted some distance, and then got rain that went through them to put chemicals and stuff down onto the ice. So it's a really kind of disparate, distinct, and separate proxy. And so to figure out where that smoke came from and under what conditions those fires were is a lot of work goes into that. A lot of thinking goes into that. And there's some variability to it. So we are trying, now that we have these really extensive networks and really good data on source allocation, where do the winds flow that reach, a mountain glacier where we took an ice core. The palynology, yes, there's really good examples of people coring through bogs or wetlands and studying fire scars along with those, looking at, fire scars in the watershed and corresponding, here's what the charcoal signal looks like, here's what the pollen signal looks like, and here what the tree ring fire scars. One of the best examples of that is working in the giant sequoia groves in Southern California, where you have tree rings that go back 3,000 years, because the temporal resolution of pollen and charcoal cores versus tree rings is often really different. In the period of time that we get really well with trees, the last 2, 3, 4, 500 years, you usually don't get at all in a pollen core. And the error around your time estimates in the pollen core can sometimes be as long as that, or it can be 50 years or decades. So you're kind of seeing these smoother wiggles in the pollen than in the tree rings, where you're like, that fire happened in the spring of 1851. The temporal precision is totally different. And so that mismatch is unfortunate. So in the project we have in New Hampshire, we're trying to kind of see what the pollen cores and the charcoal cores have to say, and then look at the tree rings in the same spot and see if we can, if not actually bridge that gap directly in time, but kind of like inform each other, you know, like the pollen might look like this because of that. And I kind of am of the belief that once you have these recurrent low severity fire regimes that happen a lot, the charcoal and the pollen cores, or the charcoal in those sediment cores kind of goes away. You just don't get a lot of charcoal generation when you have low severity fire. Yeah, plus or minus. It's a nuanced question. I don't want to go too deep into it. But it's a good one. We got one up here.
You mentioned some of the other proxy data, and I know we talked earlier that you work with some archaeologists. And I'm wondering if you've looked into things like different kinds of insects, like archaeoentomology and things like that, that need certain kinds of foods, feed on certain kinds of trees, that if you find them in archaeological sites, you can at least radiocarbon date. It's still not quite the resolution you have with dendrochronology, but have you tried looking at the proxy, like looking at how people are affecting these lands from and their relationship with fire in that regard at all?
I love that question. So just to paraphrase it, yeah. So we're trying to make connections to like archaeobotany kind of work.
Like phytoliths.
Yeah, so insects
Too.
And the fire history. Man, I'm stumped on that one. I have not. I can't think of examples of it.
I mean, the reason I'm asking, because one of the few things that I find when I work in Newfoundland, which also has the same kind of problems as we have here with bad preservation environments, we do sometimes find carapaces of beetles and stuff that go back 1,000 years and stuff like that, and they have very specific foods.
Right.
They
Yes,
need,
you try to make that fire ecology.
Yeah.
I mean, there's thinking of like one paper that came out, I don't know, probably 10 years ago that looked at basically diets of people living kind of in pinyon tree equivalents in Mexico, and the amount of rural species. So species that require fire to regenerate were really common in the diets. How are they, from lineage or something? And so that kind of told us like, well, there's a lot more fire in the landscape because these species were way more abundant in terms of just ease of access. It's kind of hard, but there might be examples of that. It would be interesting to look at, the life history traits of insects that are discovered within these archaeological sites or whatever sites. I mean, you'll pick them up in other ways and get a chronology. I like that idea. That's cool. Yeah.
I had a similar question, thinking about today, all of the places like pine barrens and other open habitats that are being managed for biodiversity. Most of that biodiversity are species that do not travel very far. The Carner blue, for example, only goes a few hundred meters in its short adult lifetime when it can fly, yet they used to run from southern Maine to Wisconsin, Minnesota. And it's just one example of species that don't move far, but depend on fire-dependent ecosystems.
Yeah.
I didn't even know paleoentomology was a thing. But is there any correlation, I wonder, between the archipelago of sites that you've sampled and all the fires you see and some of these biodiversity hotspots? In my mind, I was trying to piece together a landscape that was a mosaic of pyric and non-pyric communities, but that were somehow contiguous enough that would carry fire and support the historical populations of all the species.
Yeah, I think that's really likely. I mean, I don't know if that's a question, but yeah, I could totally see, or envision kind of a landscape or a region that is dotted, if not finely connected with all of these, like burnable, pyrophilic landscapes that have some connectivity to these, insect and other populations that can't travel very far. I mean, your example of the Carner is really interesting. Like, how could it get to Maine, to Wisconsin, if that habitat isn't there now? So definitely an indication that the habitat had been there, that the process to maintain that habitat had been there at whatever scales. We don't see a lot of synchrony in fire between this mountain range and this mountain range and this mountain range. And you're looking across the valley at them, but they tend not to burn together. That those four mountains together tend to burn. But I haven't picked up synchronous fire dates in the next mountain over.
That's the story of fire ecology even here. We don't want it to be synchronous. some sites need to burn every
Yeah.
year, but we never want the whole thing to burn in one year.
Right, yeah, because you want heterogeneity. We don't want all of everything to do the same thing all the time. Yeah, there needs to be that heterogeneity in the landscape. So for sure, I can envision that. Yeah, I feel like I had another point, but I forgot it.
Is anybody looking at that, looking at, low veg plant species, animal species
Oh,
with fire sites and trying to draw any correlation?
I don't know. I hope so. There was an exercise, this is unpublished, but there was an exercise to try to determine where these red pine stands, like in the White Mountain National Forest, would be based on the ones that we knew. And could we predict where they would be, from slope, aspect, different physiographic variables. And the model, my understanding of it was wrong in the first several iterations. And then they put in the river systems. And once you had the confluence of navigable rivers, it got it right, like every time. And so that to me was this, huge red flag, or not really a red flag, but a huge indicator that these are tied to people. That connectivity, that the locations where these stands happen to be corresponded to places where people would be camping, would be meeting, would be collecting, and that helped kind of propel these ecosystems because people like to use fire, especially when it has a lot of benefit. So that was really fascinating to me, that places you would expect it to, like these red pine stands, they were not, but where you found them was along these river systems. And so some areas probably just had a lot more than others. There are some large stands, and there's stands that just, are places that you would, you can't find it. It does like to run uphill. Yeah. These are great questions. I really appreciate it.
With you, wow.
Not that many, but
Any more from the crowd here? Yeah, you got another one?
I'm not real clear about this, but there's been a lot of logging for us last 150 years, maybe 200 years, and this, especially in the Northeast, but all across the country, really. And I know you're doing all these samples going back in time, but the environment has changed quite a bit in terms of what trees are there, what trees are left, so and what new kinds of trees are planted, maybe, or not planted, but sprout up and where there used to be other trees. And of course, climate change is changing all of that. I was just wondering how your data would be reflected. Are most of your samples in like old growth forest areas, or do you go down in areas that have been changed quite a bit by the logging and other agricultural activities?
Yeah, right. So the question's about if, how much logging affects the sample preservation and sample availability to find these. It affects it quite a bit. And, no, we don't only go to old growth areas. In fact, the stands, some of these red pine stands probably wouldn't qualify as old growth. I don't remember all of the rules around what's an old growth, but, the trees are 100, 150 years old in a lot of them, but you can find logs on the ground that go back 200 years. And so all our evidence is saying that if the stands aren't old growth, they have been there for a really long time. And we were testing the hypothesis that, do these stands predate the industrial logging period of the last 100 years, or Northern New England maybe starts 1830s, 1850s. And yes, they do. I mean, the stands were there before that. The fires occurred before that. So these red pine stands that we're studying are not artifacts, in from what I can tell, of sort of the industrial logging era. The mega fire era in New England is the 1830s, 1850s to 1947 was the last really big fire in the Northeast, burned a lot of Maine. So the logging is pretty detrimental to our sample preservation, but there are other factors at play, like just the humidity of the ecosystem, tends to rot the wood really fast, especially once it's dead. So yeah, we've lost where it's been logged and cleared, then it's all gone, right? Then I think there's a lot of areas that we could have otherwise studied that are gone because of villages got built. There's a lot of more, sandplain, pitch pine habitat that's now parking lots and, shopping malls and neighborhoods and things like that. Not only just in Albany, Concord, New Hampshire had extensive, outwash pine barrens as well. So there's, this loss of evidence from land use change for sure. Out west, we tend to get better preservation. So a lot of our samples come from cut trees that actually the live trees don't have that many fire scars on them. They're too young. But you'll be in a forest of ponderosa pine and find this old stump that's got 15 fire scars on it. That was chainsaw cut in the 60s, but it's still there, right? A chainsaw cut in the 60s here is like gone. I'll go here. I got you.
I'm wondering, especially with some of the sites in the western part of North America, if you saw any signals that kind of looked like there was frequencies of fires that occurred that might be explained by natural climate variability, like ENSO-driven changes.
Oh, for sure.
Or if it's like more stochastic, the sort of recurrence of fires.
So climate explains probably 50%, of the variability in fire. And I didn't show it here, but I have a lot of time series of fire that is, drummed up by state, by region, by, all of North America. And there's a lot of interdecadal variability. So there's decades with a lot of fire and decades with not much fire, decades with a lot, and that fits the climate system really well. So yeah. And then what's more interesting for me are the times when it doesn't, that it's like, it's really dry, but there's not a lot of fire, or, the climate is average, but there's a ton of fire. And so what's going on in those places in those times that offset, like the outliers are the most interesting one. And, that's when I kind of tend to point to people like what was happening in this place at this time, because we have way more fire than we predict based on just climate. And we are doing these predictions. The ENSO effect is very strong, typically driving the frequency and intensity of droughts in the Southwest versus the Northwest. So, an El Nino is really wet in Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, and then a La Nina is dry. And so there are years when you get, 2 El Ninos and a La Nina, and it's like, yep, no fire, a lot of fire. So those wet years build up the fuel, the dry years dry it out and cure it, and then it burns. And so we do see a very strong ENSO signal in fire histories throughout the Western US. And there's a paper, it's almost 20 years ago now, that even showed it's the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation kind of imprinted upon that. So you have ENSO, you have the Pacific decadal oscillation, and if that exists, and the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And where these things phase and come out of phase, you tend to see fire. You tend to see fire synchronized between the Southwest and Patagonia and Argentina. And that's another ENSO driven thing where they're asynchronous, I think, or no, maybe they're synchronous. I can't remember exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so you see these teleconnections driving drought and then fire. So yeah, they're definitely connected.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I know you're looking at felled trees, but are there technologies or techniques that are being explored to examine trees that are living, that are very old? Is there a way to somehow find fire markers deep in those without cutting the tree down?
Yes. So Neil is holding an increment borer and increment core. So if we just want to understand the life history of a tree, we can core it. We can bore the tree. Thank you. Yeah. So this is the standard tool of dendrochronology. It's been around for 130, 40 years.
Exactly.
It's exactly a biopsy. So it's a drill. Yeah, it removes a pencil-sized piece of wood, does not hurt the tree at all. Just about every tree in the world is well adapted to getting a small hole poked in it. Like you would say, don't put that thing in my sugar maple. I don't want it to rot. And it's like, well, then you go out and drill your sugar maple every spring.
Yeah.
So trees are very well adapted to this level of disturbance, and they protect themselves from the wound that this leaves really well. So we can extract the tree rings out of just about any tree without hurting it one iota. When a tree is fire scarred, I had one around, but this came out of a dead tree. But imagine this, as a tree that went around like this, it was probably 25 inches in diameter and had this wound out of the face of it. And then I take my chainsaw and I cut like 2% of the basal area out of that wound and leave all that wood behind. So I can remove a piece of wood this big, even bigger, another one off the other side out of a standing tree and not hurt it. And in fact, there's a study in Montana maybe, but it's out west, where they've gone back now. I think they did their 21-year update a few years ago. There's probably a 26 or 7-year update coming, where they're monitoring these trees based on like trees that were sampled for fire scars, with chainsaws removing cross sections versus trees that weren't. And basically what you're doing is you're taking a big wound and you're making it a little bit more square and a little bit uglier. Now, the trees, you're not losing enough holding wood for that tree to fall over typically. So their mortality rates aren't really any different than in like a control stand. But when these burn, you have more space for the fire to get up into the tree and burn it out. So there is a risk with fire once you've cut that sample out. However, from what I've seen and what I know my colleagues have seen even more than I have, is these trees that are fire scarred go anyway, because if they haven't burned in a long time, the fire gets into this wound, there's all that resin, it burns up the tree and the tree's going to fall, whether or not I cut a sample out of it. So my selfish perspective, I'd rather cut the sample out of it and then it's going to burn. So yeah, we can, with somewhat specialized chainsaw technique, or at least specific chainsaw techniques, we can remove a section like this out of a standing tree without hurting it. But if I'm not getting scars and I just want to know about the tree, I'll use an increment bore. It's faster, it's safer, it's easier. But yeah, thanks. Back here.
You mentioned, I don't remember which slide, if it was in New Hampshire or Pennsylvania, but you mentioned that you worked with some of the like indigenous peoples of that land. Which was it?
So I am engaged with folks in New Hampshire that represent different indigenous tribes and are helping really inform us about land use and cultural practices around fire and in places. Yeah.
So that was in New Hampshire specifically.
Yeah, in New Hampshire specifically, the Gulf of Maine study includes those same folks. I spent 10+ years working very closely with the Navajo Nation. Started in my dissertation work out there, and then worked with their forestry department. That sample I was just holding is from the Navajo Nation to understand their fire histories as part of an effort to write a vulnerability assessment report for the tribe, for their forest. So we're actively engaged, myself and colleagues, with different tribes around the Southwest and as much in the Northeast as we can be.
Yeah, that was part of my question, because I know like the indigenous peoples of this land particularly have been so completely separated from it in like a really, just a very complete way that is unlike other regions. So I'm always thinking about like how much history is lost within that, like pre-colonial burn practices in New York. I mean, I'm thinking about New York specifically because that's where I am, but in the Northeast.
That story pertains to the Northeast, it pertains to the West too. There's, a handful of tribes that have worked really, really hard to hold on to as much knowledge as they can and then rebuild that knowledge along with their next generation. Especially in Northern California has really great examples of that. Every tribe has that story to tell at some point or another. And what's been really rewarding is working with folks, talking about fire and seeing that connection sort of reignite. And kind of spurring like more curiosity. When we first started these conversations, it was like, what do you think? And then they come back with like fervor and like all this really amazing information. And that's been really rewarding to kind of, it's a small part, right? But it's connecting people back to the land in a way that I think only fire can. It's such an interesting process. It's such a part of our like human evolution that it's been fun. And I wish I could do that all the time, everywhere.
Two more questions online I can answer. Or you can answer from.
Okay.
This person asks about the Jennings Creek fire in New Jersey that burned 5,000 acres. And they wanted to know if it was common for someone like you to be consulted about that to help manage outcomes.
I don't know anything about that particular fire, and I don't actually have an answer to that question. I think what would probably be more common would be to talk to local experts in the Forest Service or other agencies.
Other question where they ask, the government plans to open up lots of acres of public lands to timber production. How do you think this will affect the forest system in general in terms of fire?
That's a good question. I think I'm going to bow out of that one.
there are noticeable difference with areas that have been disturbed by fires in terms of pests and diseases. Are there any less prevalent in areas that have burned repeatedly?
Say that again.
I think their question is if areas that have been burned repeatedly are pests and diseases less prevalent in those areas.
Oh, okay, yeah, so do you get fewer pests and diseases in areas that have recurrent fire? I don't know, that's not an aspect I study. That would be a great question for like, pine bush kind of folks.
Part of why we're studying southern pine beetle with.
Yeah.
Forest Service.
Yeah, so looking
Southern
at
pine
things
beetle
like southern
has
pine
been
beetle.
here For a decade without any noticeable impact on native trees here versus Long Island, New Jersey, where it's decimating. Hands of pitch pine, basically because there are too many pitch pine trees and they're all stressed.
I'm cognizant of the time, really dark outside. I'm happy to, take more questions and hang out for a little bit, but, folks want to get going and, we'll serve patient and kind. So thank you very much for your attention.
And I would be remiss if I did not make a plug for the rest of our science lecture series. There are several more really good lectures coming up. I'm really excited about the lecture series that we have this year and the caliber of the researchers and the speakers that are here. Last month's is here with us. And it's great to see that we're getting repeat customers. So we hope you will join us for some of the other science lecture series and a lot of the other things that are going on here at the Pine Bush. Thank you all for coming.